Welcome to this rapid revision video looking at Gorbachev, Perestroika and Glasnost, roughly meaning new thinking and reconstruction, and openness. So who was Mikhail Gorbachev? In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union. He recognized that the USSR could not carry on as it had. The Soviet economy was in trouble. It could not keep up with US military spending, and Soviet industry was not growing. As a result of the focus on military spending, living standards in the USSR and satellite states were far lower than they had been in the West. There was increasing unrest because of low living standards and a lack of human rights. In many satellite states, control was only kept through oppression, through organisations like the KGB in the USSR and the Stasi in East Germany, and others too. Threats to Soviet domination in Poland led to military exercises on the Polish border, effectively threatening Poland under Brezhnev doctrine. And there had been a lack of good leadership, with a string of leaders in poor health. Brezhnev had died after a long illness in 1982, Andropov died in 1984, and Chernikov died after less than a year in 1985. Gorbachev argued that to fix these problems, the Soviet Union needed new thinking, or perestroika. So what was Gorbachev's new thinking? Gorbachev set about making major changes to USSR policies and international relations in order to try and address the problems across the Soviet bloc. Economically, it's obvious that communism is inherently anti-capitalist, but to catch up with the West, Gorbachev began to allow some basic capitalist ideas within Soviet industries, like the profit motive. Corruption in Soviet government was a big problem. Gorbachev aimed to tackle this through a policy of glasnost, or openness. This would actually allow some criticism of the government for the first time, and also the ability to hold politicians to account if they weren't doing their jobs properly. The USSR would also no longer get involved with the affairs of the satellite states so directly. This was the end of Brezhnev doctrine, which always showed the satellite states that there was the threat of invasion if they didn't toe the line. And the war in Afghanistan would end, admittedly not immediately. But this would also mean that less would be spent on weapons, including nuclear weapons, so that money could be spent on improving living standards. Jokes can be quite revealing about a country and the mood of its people, so we're going to consider some jokes from the USSR now. Lolmunism, if you like. Even people living in oppressive regimes have a sense of humour, and sometimes feel able to poke fun at their country even if this is a risk. It's quite a useful coping strategy, as I find myself when I look at the news these days. Humour can be quite revealing about the mood and issues facing a country. So let's try a couple of Soviet jokes. If you don't laugh at them, that's fine, maybe it's in my telling of them, but try and understand the issues that they reveal about living in the Soviet Union. Soviet citizens have a 10-year waiting list for new cars. A man goes to the car dealership, hands over the money, and the dealer says, "OK, come back in 10 years and pick up your car." The customer says, "Morning or afternoon?" "Well, what difference does that make in 10 years' time?" asks the dealer. The customer replies, "Well, the plumber is coming in the morning." This joke references the delays, bureaucracy, and low living standards in the USSR, the idea that you can't just go and buy a car, you've got to go on a waiting list, and the idea that you can't even get a plumber. Gorbachev aimed to address this through his new thinking and perestroika. Let's try another one. A man walks into a KGB office to report that his talking parrot has disappeared. "What are you reporting it to us for?" replied the KGB agent. "This is not the sort of case we deal with. Report it to the police." The parrot's owner replied, "Sorry, of course I know that, but I want to make an official statement that I disagree with everything that parrot has to say." This joke references the oppression in the USSR. The idea that someone's parrot could disappear is perhaps poking fun at the fact that sometimes people disappeared and the KGB arrested them too. Also, how would this parrot know to say things against the government? Presumably, it would inform against its owner, and that's also an absurd idea and part of the joke. It may have been a slightly risky joke to tell this one to, so you'd want to make sure that they were a real friend. But the joke actually references the idea of glasnost and openness, which would hopefully begin to address people's feelings of oppression. So what did perestroika look like in practice? Between 1985 and 1989, the Soviet Union began to reduce its nuclear weapons and agree other weapons limitations with the USA. The photograph shows the signing in 1987 of the INF Treaty, which banned certain intermediate-range weapons for both the superpowers. One event that may have influenced Gorbachev's move towards glasnost and tackling corruption may have been the Chernobyl disaster. On the 26th of April 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear power station in modern-day Ukraine suffered an explosion and an uncontained reactor fire. This created a deadly cloud of radiation, resulting in 31 direct deaths and, in the years since, at least tens of thousands of deaths from disease and cancer. 350,000 people had to be permanently evacuated, an exclusion zone remains in place, and the city of Pripyat was abandoned. Although, of course, sadly, the current war in Ukraine means that this exclusion zone has become the scene of fighting. Part of the cause of this accident was the corruption and unsafe working practices caused by Soviet politics and pressure put on the workers and officials, and also a lack of openness of sharing of information. Additionally, the scale of this disaster, which would have Europe-wide impacts, meant that Soviet authorities had to reluctantly release details of the disaster to other countries in a way that they hadn't done so before. This showed to Gorbachev that this was possible, but also sometimes that it was necessary. So how did the Americans respond to Perestroika? Ronald Reagan had begun his presidency with strong rhetoric attacking the Soviet Union, once describing it as an evil empire. However, Gorbachev was clearly different from his predecessors, and Reagan felt that he could work with the new Soviet leader. Reagan saw that Gorbachev's new thinking was good for the USA and for the USSR, and so relations between the leaders, and consequently the USA and USSR overall, began to improve. We're now going to have a look at some examples of the summits and agreements that were reached between the two leaders. Let's consider the impact of these summits on international relations. We'll consider the event, the details of what happened there, and any outcomes from it. Eventually there's going to be a lot of text on here, and I'm going to have to try and do it in one take, so wish me luck. If you'd prefer to watch this and pause it and take some notes as you go, that's a good idea, or you could take a screenshot and take some notes of it at your own leisure. That's up to you, but let's get into it. The first big summit was at Geneva in Switzerland in November 1985. Here, Reagan and Gorbachev met for the first time. This was made easier by the replacement of Andrei Gromyko with Eduard Shevardnadze. Gromyko was an old hardliner and was very unwilling to compromise with the USA on a lot of things, whereas Shevardnadze was a choice who would be much better at compromising with the USA and improving relations. Nothing formal was actually agreed at Geneva, but it showed that Reagan and Gorbachev could work together, and so that was a positive outcome. Next was Reykjavik in Iceland in October 1986. Following the Chernobyl disaster, Gorbachev wanted to reduce the danger of nuclear weapons too. He suggested phasing out nuclear weapons if the USA agreed to give up their Strategic Defense Initiative, which is sometimes called Star Wars. Nobody really expected the USA to end SDI, and of course they did not. However, the talks were constructive enough to improve relations, and it showed that dialogue over difficult issues was possible. Next up was Washington in December 1987, with the Americans hosting the Soviet Union. Gorbachev came to terms that SDI was continuing. Instead, he aimed to reduce weapons and improve relations to allow savings on defence, and this worked. The two leaders signed the INF, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty. This meant that both sides would dispose of their IRBMs with a range of between 500 and 5,500 kilometres. Next came Moscow, with the Soviet Union's turn to host. Details of the INF were finalised, and it was agreed. Gorbachev also made a speech to the UN announcing a reduction in Soviet forces and an eventual withdrawal from Afghanistan. The INF treaty was kept to, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan did end. Next came Malta, 1989. Reagan had left office by this point, replaced in the election by the newly elected George Bush. That's George Herbert Walker Bush, the senior one, not the one who was there at the start of the 21st century. Gorbachev and Bush met for the first time. There were no new treaties, but it was still significant. Both leaders saw this meeting as the effective end of the Cold War. And this is what they had to say about it. "I assure the President that I will never start a hot war. The beginning of a long road to a lasting, peaceful era." Gorbachev. "We can realise a lasting peace and transform the East-West relationship." Bush. The Cold War wasn't really over, but it very nearly was. And we're going to look at the very final events of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union in a subsequent video. But for now, let's sum up our final points. Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the USSR in 1985. He recognised significant problems in the USSR and satellite states. The economy could not support weapons spending and keep up with the USA. Living standards and human rights were well behind the standards seen in the West. Soviet states often resorted to oppression to control their populations. There had been a series of ineffective and unwell leaders. Gorbachev set about policies described as New Thinking and Restructuring, or Perestroika. This would allow more capitalist features in the economy, and a reduction in arms spending with a withdrawal from Afghanistan eventually. Added to this was the principle of Glasnost, or openness. This would see the end of the Brezhnev doctrine and meddling in the affairs of other countries backed by the threat of force. It would also reduce government corruption and allow people to express opposition to their government, a change possibly slightly brought about by the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. These changes helped lead to better relations with President Reagan and later President Bush. A series of summits and agreements followed between 1985 and 1989, including the INF, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, in 1987, and an effective end to the Cold War announced at Malta in 1989. So there was more to come. Next video we'll have a look at the very end of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. But for now, that's the end of this video. I hope it's been useful to you, and if it has, please do drop the video a like and subscribe to the channel. If there's something else that you want me to cover or you need help with, drop it in the comments below and I'll see what I can do. But for now, thanks again and goodbye.